Kevin Mitnick was probably the world's most notorious cyber thief when he was captured in 1995 and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Over a 13-year period, Mitnick broke into the computer systems of more than 35 major international corporations and other organizations, exploits that made him the FBI's most wanted computer criminal. When we first sat down with Mitnick in January of 2000, just before his release from federal prison, he told us that he saw himself not as a devious criminal, but more like a merry prankster.
I saw myself as an electronic joyrider having a great time on the information superhighway. I felt like I was like James Bond behind the computer. It was a big game to me. I was just having a blast.
Did it ever occur to you that perhaps what you were doing was wrong?
Oh yeah, yeah. It was an invasion of privacy. You know, going and getting access to other people's information is obviously a gross invasion of privacy, and it is wrong.
And that didn't bother you?
At the time I was doing it, no.
Good morning. I'm here in Gasworks Park in Seattle, overlooking beautiful Seattle at a sunrise, this time instead of sunset, so I think I'll have enough sunlight. And I want to talk to you about cybersecurity and crime. So let's dive right in, and we'll start with this idea of cybersecurity. Now, I kind of chose the term cybersecurity because I think it's the most descriptive, but actually the term of art, especially at the University of Washington, is information assurance. But information assurance, IA, kind of conflicts with the IA that we studied earlier in the class, so I'm going to stick to cybersecurity. It's also computer security, or hacking sometimes it's called. Those are all the words, but let's focus in on what exactly it means, cybersecurity, and what exactly the nature of cybersecurity is. So that's where we're going to start. I'll give you what's called the CIA model, and looking at the diagram here, it sort of looks like something a CIA type organization would come up with. In the middle is information, and notice, in the middle is information. That's what cybersecurity is all about. It's about protecting or assuring information. So this is smack dab in the middle of our area of concern of information. So exactly what about information needs to be protected or needs to be safeguarded? Well, the confidentiality of the information, right? That's obvious. Information that's meant to stay private should stay private. That's the idea. But not only the confidentiality, not only like not letting it get into the hands of the people who might use it for ill purposes, but also the availability of the information. So it doesn't do to have information confidential if even the people who need to get at it can't get at it. So an example of making it unavailable is what we'll see later, something called a denial of service attack. And in a denial of service attack, it's not that the information is compromised, it's that the access to the information is compromised. A website is inundated with so many requests that people who have a legitimate need to get the information from that website are unable to do so. Okay, so it's the confidentiality, that's obvious. It's also the availability. And then finally, the integrity. A lot of times what happens in what we'll later call an attack is that the information is changed or modified or defaced in some way. So we'll see examples, especially when we look later at the anonymous movement, that a lot of times what they do is they don't compromise the availability of information. They don't compromise the confidentiality of information because they haven't gotten any confidential information. All they do is like deface the information. So they deal with the integrity of the information, and oftentimes we'll see also later on how someone can delete information. They're not getting the information, but they're compromising the information. Okay, so that's the idea. It's basically protecting information, protecting its confidentiality, its accessibility, and its integrity. Okay, let's go to the next level of the circle, and what this level of the circle talks about and is the what exact parts can be compromised. And I guess I'll just use the term hack. We'll contrast it later with the term crack. The term crack is actually the better term, but you know, who's to say? Now hack has become such a term of art for the process of attacking information that we'll just basically use the word hack. So where is the hack? What exactly gets hacked? Hardware can get hacked. So something can happen that compromises the hardware so that it gives access to information that wouldn't have been allowed otherwise. The software can be hacked. That's kind of the classic hack. Software is much more vulnerable than the hardware because usually the hardware Usually the hardware is somewhere where you can't actually get to it or affect it except through software. So remember, the differentiation between hardware and software is not so hard and fast as it might first seem. The hardware is obviously the devices, but the devices run software. So your router, for example, your wireless router has software running that controls its operation. So when it's hacked, is the hardware hacked? Well, yeah, the hardware is hacked because the router is affected in some way. But how is it hacked? It was hacked through the software. So you can hack hardware. You can change the hardware, but usually you're changing the hardware through the software. And then finally, communications. For example, when you're in a coffee shop and you're using an unsecured Wi-Fi connection, and someone elsewhere in the coffee shop is monitoring that communication, is monitoring the interchange between you and the Wi-Fi router, that's hacking the communication. They're kind of tapping into your communication, and that could happen anywhere in any network. On network computers throughout the world, lots and lots of internet traffic goes through. You can what's called sniff that traffic for packets of information that are interesting to you, and in that way compromise the security, the availability, or the integrity of the information. Okay, then finally, what exactly is getting hacked? And here there's really two basic distinctions. You can hack products, so you can compromise, and you know this happens all the time. Microsoft finds what's called a vulnerability. A vulnerability is something that can be exploited, so vulnerability is exploited. That's all kind of vocabulary from this world. So Microsoft finds a vulnerability in their product that can be exploited by hackers, and they release a patch. And you remember from our World of Warcraft discussions that a patch is a temporary fix. It goes over the existing code, so you don't have to reinstall Windows, for example. You patch Windows, and these patches make sure that certain parts of the code that are vulnerable are fixed. So the patch goes over the code just like the patch goes over a hole in your pair of pants. Okay. So products can get hacked, but also people can get hacked. And we'll see in just a moment that this idea of social engineering is all about hacking people. So you don't have to hack the hardware or the software, because the people will tell you everything you need to know in order to get into the system. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a fair overview of the idea of cybersecurity or information assurance, what gets attacked, what it is we're trying to protect from the attack, and exactly how that attack occurs, through people or through products. All right, so the core of what I want to talk to you about is the various attacks, and a few of the more interesting or useful ones for you to know about. And we'll start with this concept of social engineering, which is hacking people. Then we'll talk about denial of service, which is, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the idea of inundating a server with so much communication that valid communication can't get through. Zombie computers, a great name for for the idea that someone can come in and literally take over your computer, and not exactly take it over but really install and run software in your computer. That's really the bottom line of zombie computers. They're installing and running software in your computers, and of course software in your computer can pretty much do whatever you want it to do. For example, it could tell what you're typing into the computer, so when you type your passwords they might be compromised, for example. Phishing and identity theft, P-H-I-S-H-I-N-G. PH was all the rage for you substituting in for F. I'm not sure it's so popular to do that anymore, but when this term was invented, it's really phishing, F-I-S-H-I-N-G. Phishing for what? Phishing for your information. And we'll talk about that as well as the idea of identity theft. Cross-site scripting and SQL injection are a little bit more technical, but I think you have enough from this course already to understand these two more technical hacks, and we'll get to those by the end. Let's start with social engineering, and let's look at this video that I think gives you a really fair overview of the idea of social engineering.
Social Engineering, Lesson 1. The Art of Deception. The honest reality about your network is that in spite of all of the incredible effort that your network administrators put into protecting it, all of the firewall and antivirus software, all the additional security measures, there is one link that is always the weakest. And that link is you. So what is social engineering? According to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, it's an outside hacker's use of psychological tricks on legitimate users of a computer system in order to obtain information he needs to gain access to a system. Or it's getting needed information, for example a password, from a person rather than breaking into a system. Or social engineering involves gaining sensitive information or unauthorized access privileges by building inappropriate trust relationships with insiders. Here are some comments from notorious hacker Kevin Mitnick. He said, "The weakest link in the security chain is the human element." And according to a March 2000 article in the Washington Post, he said, in more than half of his successful network exploits, he gained information about the network, sometimes including access to the network, through social engineering. He also said, you could spend a fortune purchasing technology and services, and your network infrastructure could still remain vulnerable to old-fashioned manipulation. These are the simple definitions for what a social engineer does, but how is it we are so easily tricked? Well, social engineering is not a new thing at all. In reality, it's probably as old as speech and goes back to the first lie itself. Social engineering is still successful today because people are generally helpful, especially to someone who is nice, knowledgeable, and/or insistent. And remember, social engineering cannot be blocked by technology alone. In fact, Kevin Mitnick, from his book The Art of Deception, brings out that people inherently want to be helpful and therefore are easily duped. They assume a level of trust in order to avoid conflict. It's all about gaining access to information that people think is innocuous when it isn't. Yes, it's true. We want to believe people. When we hear a nice voice on the other line insisting that we help them, or when we hear that they can help us, we want to listen to them. We respond. It's part of our trusting human behavior.
Now let's look at the idea of denial of service. This is a video from Symantec. It's a little bit advertising, but I think it actually does a really good job of not only going over some concepts that you've learned before in this class, and I would like you to notice in these videos how much you actually know and how much you've learned in this class that allows you to look at something like this and not be learning for the first time what it's saying, but instead have it reinforce concepts that you already know, particularly in this one, the concept of the network itself and how information passes through the network.
Quick guide to scary internet stuff number 6. Denial of service attacks. The internet. It's just a big filing system. A really big filing system. And all the files are stored in a thing called a server. It's just like a filing cabinet. A really big filing cabinet. And there are lots of them all over the world. Anyone can have one, big or small companies or a government agency, like your local school or hospital. It's where they keep all their important documents and their websites. Here's how it works. Every time you want to look at a web page, you send the server a polite request, and it sends you the web page. Simple. So simple that scary internet bad guys like to take advantage of it. They choose a server to attack and start making requests. Lots of requests. So many requests that the server can't keep up, and eventually it stops working altogether. Then no one can see anything that's stored on it. It's called a denial of service attack, and it's bad news. Because sometimes the things on servers are really important. And the super scary thing is, to mount a successful attack, a scary internet bad guy needs an army. Not a normal army. A zombie botnet army. And that's you. They can take over your computer and turn it into a zombie and make it do their evil work. So, if you want to help put a stop to this sort of thing, first take a look at Symantec's other guides to scary internet stuff, especially the one on botnets. It'll explain how you can end up being part of a zombie botnet army. And then, to make sure your computer stays under your control, install some top-notch security software, like Norton Internet Security or Symantec Endpoint Protection. Anyway, thanks for listening.
Now let's look at a video on botnets, also from Symantec, and also followed by a commercial. So what should you do about all these security threats? Of course, you should buy Symantec products, and that'll protect.
Quick guide to scary internet stuff and how to be safe. Number 2. Botnets, or Attack of the Zombie Computers. Of all the scary internet stuff, botnets are some of the scariest. Bots are web robots that sneak into computers, the weak and unprotected ones, and turn them into zombies. Zombie computers turn other computers into more zombies, till in the end there's a zombie computer army. And who controls the botnet? The Botmaster. He can make websites drown in data. He can copy and steal software. He rents out his zombie computer army to other internet baddies, and 40% of all spam comes from botnets. 320 million spam emails a day. So, what if a bot gets into your computer? The Botmaster rules. He could log your keystrokes, so every time you log onto your bank or make a payment, he can see exactly what you're doing. He can steal your passwords, copy your bank details, and use your computer to help commit his online crimes. You could be infected right now. Your computer could be a zombie, and you may not even know. If your computer's running slowly, or you're getting messages about suspicious connections, be afraid. So, here's what to do. Don't click on email attachments from unknown or untrusted sources. Make sure you have a firewall. Make sure it's turned on. Make sure Windows is up to date. And make sure you have security software with live updates, like Norton Internet Security or Norton Antibot from Symantec. Then give zombies the big... Thank you for looking at our guide to scary internet stuff and how to be safe.
Here's an introduction to the idea of phishing, and specifically how people use phishing techniques in order to get your personal information.
You've probably seen it. You receive an email from your bank or trusted company, and it's asking you for information. It looks real, but it's designed to fool you into handing over important information. This is a scam called phishing, and you need to avoid it. This is phishing scams in plain English. Most of us have gotten used to doing business online. We buy and sell things. We have accounts with sensitive information. The risk of doing business online is low as long as you deal directly with organizations you trust. Problems occur when criminals impersonate these organizations and fool you into handing over sensitive information like account numbers, passwords, and PIN numbers. The key to avoiding this scam is awareness. Here's one example. You receive an email that looks like a trustworthy message from a bank. It asks you to click a link to verify information. You assume it's legit, so you click the link and log in to what appears to be your bank's website. At this point, the scam is complete. You've handed over your bank password to the crooks who can use it to take your money. Boo! They were able to fool you by impersonating the bank's website. There are a few keys to detecting phishing emails. They often try to scare you by saying your account has been accessed or security has been compromised. They also insist that you click a link to verify information or fill out a form. Do not click links or fill out forms in suspicious emails. The email may also have misspellings and call you something like valued customer. The crooks don't know your name. Remember, phishing emails may use the exact same logos, phone numbers, and addresses that appear on your statements or bills. Always be suspicious of an email that asks for your information. No exceptions. If you receive a phishing email, stay calm. There's no risk to receiving it. Just delete it. You can also safely report it by forwarding it to reportphishing@antiphishing.org or spam@uce.gov. If an email does lead you to a suspicious website, remember to look at the web address. The address in your browser should look familiar. If you suspect that criminals have your information, immediately contact organizations where you have accounts. To protect yourself in the long run, you might also consider anti-phishing software. Further, check your online accounts and credit reports regularly, and quickly report anything that is out of place. Phishing scams are a growing threat on the internet. By being aware of the scam, you can feel confident in working with companies online. Yay! I'm Lee Lefevre, and this has been Phishing Scams in Plain English on the Common Craft Show. One more thing, you can download presentation quality versions of our videos without ads like this in the Common Craft store.
Cross-site scripting. So let's just unpack that term first. Cross-site means from one site to another. Scripting means I put in some script, and specifically here, in the case that I'll show you, it's specifically HTML script. So HTML code, you know, is what creates the user interface inside of a web page, right? We've talked about that a number of times. HTML creates the user interface inside of a website, and so cross-site scripting, if you're using HTML, you can use other things as well, but if you're using HTML, cross-site scripting means putting the user interface from one site inside another site. So you get the idea. It's a very clever idea, and it's worked very well in a number of cases. Now, for all of these attacks, obviously there are ways to thwart the attack or to prevent it from happening, but that doesn't mean that there aren't vulnerabilities in lots of websites. So the idea of a cross-site scripting basically is I'm going to put my user interface from my site inside of your site. You think you're interacting with your site, or you think you're interacting with site A, but in fact you're interacting with my site, and I'm going to use my user interface to collect information from you. Okay, so let's look at an example of this. The idea here is we're in a chat site. In a chat site, you have user interface for entering comments, right? You enter a comment, and then you post a comment, and it goes back up on somebody else's thread, and they respond to it, etc., right? You can type whatever you want in that comment. You could type gobbledygook in that comment. You could also, if the site isn't smart about this, you can also type HTML in that comment. If you type HTML in that comment, when it displays on the other user's site, it's actually going to produce a little piece of user interface. And the piece of HTML that you can type into their site might be a piece of HTML that creates a form that says, oh, hey, we logged you out. Sorry about that. Can you type your name and your password in again? Get the idea? That piece of user interface is actually a piece of user interface to my site, not to the original site. I typed that piece of user interface as text into a comment box. When it was displayed on the other person's site, it looked like a piece of user interface. It happens all the time. In fact, there's an exploit inside of Facebook that has just recently come about where they put in a little button that says delete this post. It looks like delete this post on the Facebook page, but in fact it's delete this post that posts to somebody else's site and then does all sorts of malicious stuff. Okay, so do you get the idea of the cross-site scripting? Cross-site scripting is specifically about I put my user interface into your site. How do I do that? By typing my user interface as HTML into some input control, into some control that allows me to then post that HTML back onto your website and have it look like user interface. So very clever exploit, but one that's not so hard to protect against. What do you do? So think about it. What could you do? What would you do to protect your site from this idea of cross-site scripting? Well, what you would do is you'd look at the content of things that people type into your input controls and make sure they're not typing any HTML in there. Now, it's kind of a problem, like on a chat site, maybe you want them to type HTML in there, right? So you're going to have to be more clever about it than that. You're going to have to say, well, you can type some HTML in there, like I can allow you to make something bold, but I'm not going to allow you to put a submit button in there. I'm not going to allow you to put a text box in there, right? So you specifically restrict not, what is user interface? Content, controls, and decoration, right? You allow the decoration in the content, but you don't allow the controls. Okay, so that's the idea of cross-site scripting. All right, let's end with this idea, or the exploit, or the hack of SQL injection. And I love this one because you can so understand it from what we've already learned about SQL. So there is one extra thing I have to tell you, however, about SQL before you can understand that, and that's that we've only studied one part of SQL, and that's the part of SQL that does queries. Oh, there's a cool flock of seagulls flying overhead. Very nice. Very nice morning, by the way, although it could rain any second. So what we know about SQL is that it can do queries, right? We can do select from where, and that will retrieve information from our database. Well, queries, it turns out, are not only questions about can you retrieve information from me, but in SQL at least, there are also queries about, for example, can you delete information, or can you update information, or even stuff like can you create tables. So a SQL query can do a lot more than simply just retrieving information, and that's what this SQL exploit, this SQL injection, is all about. So the term SQL injection, what does that mean? It means I'm injecting, I'm putting SQL commands, I'm putting SQL queries into the system that weren't there before. As I said before, remember what I said before about SQL queries, that they're usually running on the server, right? They're not running on the client. You don't type a query into the client and then that accesses the database, that accesses the data tier. No. You type just input. You type your name, your address, your telephone number, whatever. Then that's translated into a query on the server, and then that query on the server queries the database. Well, this is a slick little method for giving the server a query that it didn't know it had. Okay, so in a usual input control, you just type your name, for example, or you type your email address or something like that. And in the SQL injection, instead of typing your name or your email address into this control, you actually type in a query that you want the server to run. And by doing slick things, breaking the query in certain ways, you actually fool the server computer into running your query. And then the results are whatever you wanted to have happen. So let's look at a specific example. And I've taken this example from the work that we did previous on the Pandora cycle. Remember, I gave you this idea of data going all the way from the server, from the data tier all the way to the presentation tier, and then we talked about data going from the presentation tier all the way back to the server tier, all the way back to the data tier. And this was the example that I used for the data going from the presentation layer to the data tier. And just briefly to review that idea, we have a piece of user interface here, right? This user interface is written in HTML. It shows up in a web page. This is a thin client application. This is what we've been talking about. And notice that I can really start to talk at a really sophisticated technical level now, because you have the vocabulary and you have the background. So that's exactly what I'm hoping you get from this class, is the ability to understand that sort of vocabulary and talk at a level that allows you to talk about very interesting things with very interesting people. Okay, so we have a user interface here. That user interface has some decoration like the word Pandora. It has some content like this word's register for free, and then it has controls. These are all input controls because you input information, right? You input your email, your password, your birth year, blah, 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 blah. And you are expecting when you do that, that you will register for Pandora. And in the vast, vast, vast majority of cases, you are registering for Pandora. But along comes someone with malicious intent. And by the way, I'm not saying that you could do this in this user interface. This is completely a made-up example. And in fact, I've really simplified it. The actual SQL injection is a little bit more sophisticated than what I'm showing you here, but not all that much more sophisticated. I've just trimmed it down a little bit so that you can understand it without really knowing without really knowing the SQL language. Okay, so we have a UI here. It's the people UI. It's meant to update the user table or the people table, right? It's inside of Pandora. That's what we talked about before. We have input controls, and then we have those action controls down there. That's how this user interface works. Okay, so usually you type your email in there, but I'm the malicious guy, and I'm going to type a query in there. And the query in there is select password from people where email equals bob@uw.edu. So what's the hack here? I happen to know the email address, and what do I want? I want the guy's password, right? I want the guy's account information. And so I want to select the password from the people table where the email equals bob@uw.edu. Now notice bob@uw.edu is actually what's supposed to go in there. And so I'm kind of exploiting a loophole here to make it think that I'm typing in what it wants me to type in, but in fact, I'm typing in a query, and I'm going to get the server to run that query. And when it runs that query, what's going to come back? Bob's password, right? That's what I want to have. And so screen number 2, now I'm doing the reverse. I'm going from the data layer back to the user interface, right? I've tricked the server into running this query that returns the password. And what it thinks it's saying to me is, welcome at bob@meditorial.com or bob@uw.edu, right? You are now a member of so it ran the query, it got back the password, and into the screen where it was like the welcome, you're now a member of our site, it actually injected the password. So the password comes back to the person. Now again, this is a simplified example, but this is not dissimilar to what real SQL injection does. Other things that SQL injection does, it can delete information, it can list all the records, so I could say, give me back what happens if I don't use a where clause, right? So select password from the people table, and don't say which user. What's that going to do? We've talked about this a few times. What's that going to do? It's going to return all the passwords, and I can say select username password from this table if I can kind of guess the name of the table. Right, I do have to guess the name of the table, but what else are you going to call it? User, people, persons, you know, there's only a limited number of names, and I try them all because I'm a hacker and I'm out there, you know, for hours and hours just playing around. So I create the query, I inject the query into the server runs the query for me. The query either returns information that I want to compromise information, or maybe it to compromise the confidentiality of the information, or maybe I do malicious things like I kill the entire user table and all of a sudden the site goes down. So now I'm just, you know, marauding inside of their site.